The scent of pine needles and cool earth filled the air as I tightened the straps of my backpack, adjusting the weight on my shoulders. The sun was dipping below the tree line, casting golden light over the scattered tents and camping gear. It was the third day of our annual trip, me, Dave, and a few of the guys. A tradition of hiking, bad jokes, and pretending we knew how to start a fire without looking up a tutorial. But this year, something was different. Or maybe I was different. I stole a glance at Dave, watching as he laughed at something Jake said, his head tilting back just slightly. The firelight flickered across his face, making the sharp angles of his jawline stand out. He looked the same as always, same easy confidence, same messy dark hair falling into his eyes, but it felt different. It had been like this for weeks now. Little things. Things I shouldn't have noticed. The way Dave's arm brushed against mine when we walked side by side. The way his voice got softer when he spoke just to me. The way my stomach twisted into a complicated knot every time he looked at me a second too long. I kept telling myself it was in my head. That I was imagining things. Dave was straight. At least, that's what I'd always thought. But now? Now I wasn't sure. And tonight, sharing a tent with him, just the two of us, was going to test every ounce of self-control I had. You good? Dave's voice cut through my thoughts. I blinked, realizing I'd been staring at the fire for too long. Yeah, I said quickly, probably too quickly. Just tired. Dave's eyes flickered over me, something unreadable in his gaze. You've been weird lately. I swallowed, forcing out a laugh. Dude. That's just my personality. He smirked, but didn't drop it. Nah, I mean it. You keep zoning out. You barely said anything on the hike today. I shrugged, shifting uncomfortably. Just thinking. Dave tilted his head. Thinking about what? You. The answer sat heavy in my chest, but I shoved it down, deep where it couldn't escape. Stuff, I muttered, kicking at the dirt with the toe of my boot. Dave didn't look convinced. I grabbed my water bottle and took a long sip, hoping to do something with my hands before they started shaking. But Dave was still watching me, like he was trying to figure something out. And then he moved closer. Just a little. Barely enough for anyone else to notice. But I noticed. Because suddenly, the air around us felt different. Like we weren't just two best friends at a campsite anymore. Like something was shifting beneath us, something dangerous and thrilling. Dave's gaze flicked toward the others. Jake and Ethan were still laughing, half focused on whatever story they were telling. No one was paying attention to us. His voice was lower when he spoke next. You sure that's all it is? I opened my mouth, shut it again. Because I had no idea how to answer that. And the worst part? I wasn't sure he did either. The fire crackled, sending tiny embers swirling into the night air. The group was still caught up in their usual banter, Ethan arguing about conspiracy theories, Jake dramatically reenacting a near-death squirrel encounter from earlier that day. It should have felt like any other night. But it didn't. Not for me. Not with Dave sitting just inches away, his knee barely brushing against mine. Not with the way my brain refused to focus on anything except him. I had spent years convincing myself that our friendship was just that, friendship. That whatever warmth I felt around him, whatever momentary lapses in breath when he touched my shoulder, meant nothing. But lately, I wasn't so sure. And tonight? Tonight, I could feel something shifting between us. I glanced at him out of the corner of my eye. He was staring into the fire, deep in thought, absently running his thumb over the top of his water bottle. His expression was unreadable, but his jaw was tense. Hi, thanks for watching this far. If you're enjoying the video, leave a comment and share your thoughts about the story. We're reading every single one. And hey, thanks again. Now, let's get back to it. Like he was thinking about something he didn't know how to say. Then, almost like he could feel me watching, Dave turned his head and met my gaze. I froze. His eyes flickered, searching mine for something. For a second, just a second, I thought he might actually say it. That he might break the silence and bring up whatever had been simmering between us for weeks. Instead, he exhaled and asked, "Have you ever thought about, guys?" My stomach dropped. My grip tightened around my water bottle, the plastic crinkling under my fingers. I forced a laugh, praying it didn't sound as strained as it felt. You mean, like, in general? Or are you asking if I've thought about Bigfoot in a romantic way? Dave rolled his eyes, but there was something almost relieved in his smirk. You're so annoying. I shrugged. It's part of my charm. He shook his head, but his question still hung in the air, unanswered. And the worst part? He wasn't looking away. If anything, he was waiting. My heart was pounding so hard I was sure he could hear it. I knew I had two options. Dodge it completely, laugh it off, pretend I didn't know what he meant. Say something honest and risk whatever came next. I swallowed hard, forcing myself to meet his gaze. I hesitated, then shrugged. Yeah. I guess I have. The fire crackled, filling the space between us. Something in Dave's expression changed. Just a flicker, barely there, but I saw it. Like he was processing something. I wanted to ask. Wanted to push. But before I could, Jake stretched his arms over his head and groaned dramatically. All right, gentlemen. I'm calling it. Time for bed before I get eaten by a bear or something. Ethan snorted. Bears don't even come this far down. Jake waved him off, already heading toward his tent. Yeah, well, neither does common sense, but here you are. That was our cue. I stood, brushing dirt off my jeans, my mind still spinning with Dave's question. Had he asked just to mess with me? Or was there something else there? As I reached for my backpack, Dave stood too. He stretched his arms over his head, his shirt riding up slightly, exposing just a sliver of skin. I looked away, trying not to let my brain go there. You ready? He asked, his voice quieter now. I nodded. But as we walked toward our tent, just the two of us, I couldn't shake the feeling that something big had just shifted between us. And that tonight? Tonight was going to change everything. The tent was smaller than I remembered. It wasn't like I hadn't shared a tent with Dave before. We'd done this every year, tossed our sleeping bags onto the floor, cracked dumb jokes until we passed out. It was normal. But tonight? Nothing about it felt normal. I sat cross-legged on my sleeping bag, pretending to rummage through my backpack, but my hands weren't really looking for anything. My mind was stuck on Dave's question from earlier. Have you ever thought about, guys? I replayed it over and over, dissecting the way he said it, the way he had waited for my answer. Was it just curiosity? Or was there something else buried underneath? I stole a glance at him. He was lying on his back, one arm folded behind his head, staring at the tent ceiling like it held some deep, life-changing answers. Something about the way he was thinking made my pulse quicken. You're still being weird, Dave murmured, not looking at me. I let out a breath that wasn't quite a laugh. And you're still calling me out on it. Because I know you, he said simply. He turned his head, finally meeting my gaze, his expression unreadable. And I know when something's messing with you. I swallowed. And what if something is? His eyes flickered. Then tell me. The word sat heavy between us. I hesitated. I could say something casual, brush it off, pretend I wasn't on the verge of unraveling. Or I could finally be honest. I exhaled, rubbing the back of my neck. Things feel different lately, I admitted. And I don't know why. I stopped, shaking my head. I can't stop thinking about it. Dave didn't look away. Didn't laugh. Didn't make a joke. He just watched me. And then, quietly, me neither. My breath caught. My fingers curled into my sleeping bag as my brain scrambled to make sense of his words. "Wait," I said slowly. "What do you mean?" He sat up slightly, resting his weight on one elbow. His voice was low, careful. "I mean..." He hesitated, like he was testing the words before he said them. "I don't know what this is. I don't know why he exhaled sharply. But I know I keep thinking about it. About you." A chill ran down my spine. Not from fear. From the realization that this wasn't just in my head. That all the small moments, the glances, the touches, the tension, had meant something to him too. I didn't even realize I was holding my breath until he shifted closer, his knee barely brushing against mine. It felt like the air between us had turned electric. "Say something," Dave murmured, his voice quieter now. I swallowed, my mouth suddenly dry. I don't know what to say." He nodded slowly, as if he understood. "Yeah. Me neither." But neither of us moved. Neither of us pulled away. And I realized, in that moment, that we were standing on the edge of something huge. Something that, once crossed, we could never take back. And the craziest part? I didn't want to. The tent felt smaller. Warmer. Like the air had thickened, pressing in on me from all sides. Dave was still close, too close, his knee barely touching mine, his eyes locked onto mine like he was waiting for something. Like he wanted me to make the first move. But how could I? My heart was hammering so loud I was sure he could hear it. My brain was screaming at me to do something, to say something. But I couldn't. Because nothing made sense anymore. Nothing except the fact that Dave wasn't pulling away. I swallowed hard. "I don't," my voice cracked. I cleared my throat and tried again. "I don't get it." Dave exhaled slowly. "Me neither." Silence stretched between us, charged and heavy. And then he moved. Just slightly. A shift of weight, a tilt of his head, like he wasn't sure what he was doing but couldn't stop himself. And neither could I. Before I could second guess it, before my brain could remind me of all the reasons why this shouldn't be happening, I leaned in. So did he. The space between us vanished. And then his lips touched mine. It was hesitant. Careful. Like we were testing something fragile, something that could shatter if we weren't careful. But the second it happened, something inside me clicked. Like I had been holding my breath for years without realizing it. Like this was what I had been waiting for. His fingers brushed against my arm, light and uncertain, sending a jolt through my entire body. My own hands clenched in my lap, like I was afraid to touch him back. Because if I did, if I let myself feel this, really, truly feel it, then there was no going back. But then Dave pulled back, just slightly, his forehead still inches from mine. His breathing was unsteady, his eyes wide. "Alex," he murmured. My name. Just my name. But it sounded different coming from him now. I exhaled shakily. "Yeah?" He searched my face like he was trying to figure something out. Like he was trying to make sense of what just happened. Like he was waiting for permission. And in that moment, I knew. I wanted this. No more second guessing. No more pretending. So this time, when I leaned in, when I kissed him again, I didn't hold back. Morning came too fast. I knew it was morning before I even opened my eyes. The air inside the tent had cooled, the distant sound of birds chirping weaving through the quiet. And then, I felt him. Dave. Close. His body was barely an inch from mine, his breath steady and warm in the space between us. My heart lurched in my chest as last night slammed back into my mind. The kiss. The second kiss. The way neither of us wanted to stop. I barely breathed as I opened my eyes. Dave was already awake, staring at the roof of the tent, his face unreadable. For a second, I thought he was going to pretend it didn't happen. That he'd roll over, stretch, crack a dumb joke, and that would be that. But he didn't. Instead, without looking at me, he whispered, "What are we supposed to do now?" I swallowed, my throat tight. "I don't know." Silence. I could hear my own pulse, loud and frantic in my ears. Then, he finally turned his head, meeting my gaze. His expression was different than last night. Not hesitant, not uncertain. But thoughtful. Like he was really thinking about this. And that terrified me. Because I hadn't thought past last night. I hadn't thought about the after. All I knew was that I wanted it. Wanted him. And if I admitted that now, if I let myself say it out loud, there'd be no going back. Dave's fingers twitched slightly where they rested between us. Like he was considering reaching for me. Like he was thinking about it as much as I was. Then, quietly, "I don't regret it." My breath caught. I sat up slightly, resting my weight on my elbow, really looking at him. "You don't?" He shook his head. Something warm spread through my chest, pushing away some of the fear. Then, just as fast as it came, it was drowned out by something else. The guys. The outside world. I sat up fully, rubbing a hand over my face, reality slamming into me like a cold wave. "What if someone finds out?" I muttered. Dave exhaled through his nose, like he'd been expecting that question. "We don't have to tell anyone," he said simply. My heart twisted. I knew what he meant. He was offering me an out. A way to keep this ours, without anyone else knowing. But a small, stubborn part of me hated that idea. Because it meant this was something that had to be hidden. I glanced at him again. His eyes were on me, watching. Waiting. Then, he reached out. Just for a second. Just long enough for his fingers to brush against my wrist. A silent question. I swallowed hard. "Baby steps?" he asked. I forced a small smile, even though my chest felt tight. "Yeah. Baby steps." His face softened, like he could tell I was still fighting myself. But he didn't push. And that meant everything. The silence stretched, filled with thoughts neither of us said out loud. Then, from outside the tent. "Hey, are you two gonna sleep all day or what?" Ethan's voice. Dave and I both startled slightly, like we had been caught doing something we shouldn't. He shot me a look, one last glance, one that said, "We'll talk about this later." I nodded. A few seconds passed before we both shifted away from each other, untangling our sleeping bags and pretending like nothing had changed. But deep down, I knew everything had. The rest of the morning passed in a strange, fragile normalcy. The sun was already high by the time Dave and I finally stepped out of the tent, our faces unreadable, carefully neutral, as if nothing had happened. But I could feel it. The unspoken tension clung to us, like an invisible thread tying us together. Jake and Ethan were already sitting around the campfire, laughing over some inside joke, completely unaware that my entire world had tilted off its axis. Finally, Jake groaned, throwing a pine cone in our direction. "Thought you two were gonna sleep all day." "Yeah," Ethan added, smirking. "Or were you guys in there whispering secrets?" My stomach twisted. It was a joke. A completely harmless, stupid joke. But Dave tensed beside me, and suddenly, the air between us felt suffocating. I forced a laugh, shaking my head as I grabbed my backpack. Yeah, man. We were plotting world domination. It was enough to shift the attention away, but the damage was already done. Because I realized something right then. I didn't want this to be a joke. I didn't want to pretend nothing happened. But I also wasn't sure if I was brave enough to admit that. We hiked for hours. Through the dense forest, over fallen logs and uneven trails. The group talked and laughed, the same as always, but Dave and I hung back, letting the others drift ahead. And when we were finally alone, when all I could hear was the rustling of leaves and the sound of our footsteps, he finally spoke. So, he said, his voice careful. About last night. I swallowed hard. Yeah. Silence. I could feel the weight of the question hanging in the air between us. Did it? Dave hesitated. Then, quietly, did it mean something to you? I stopped walking. I don't know why. Maybe because it was the first time he'd actually asked. Maybe because I could tell that this wasn't just curiosity anymore. He needed to know. I turned to him. He was watching me carefully, his jaw tight, his hand stuffed into his hoodie pockets like he was bracing himself for whatever answer I was about to give. And for the first time since this all started, I didn't want to lie. I didn't want to downplay it. I didn't want to pretend. So I took a breath. And said the truth. Yeah, I admitted, my voice steady. It did. Something shifted in Dave's expression. Relief. Maybe something else, too, something deeper. He exhaled, running a hand through his hair. Good, he muttered. Because if it didn't, I was gonna feel really stupid. A short laugh escaped me. Yeah? Yeah. His lips twitched into a small, nervous smile. Because it meant something to me too. The world felt like it had just stopped. I don't know what I expected him to say. Maybe that it was a mistake. That he was confused. That we should just go back to normal and forget this ever happened. But instead, he chose this. Chose us. And just like that, the fear I had been carrying around, the doubt, the uncertainty, didn't seem so heavy anymore. It was still there, sure. But it didn't feel impossible. We kept walking, letting the silence stretch between us in a way that felt comfortable for the first time in days. Then, when we were deep enough in the woods, when I was sure no one else could see us, Dave suddenly reached for my wrist, stopping me mid-step. I turned, confused. What? And then he kissed me. Not hesitant this time. Not unsure. This time, it was a choice. A slow, deliberate, undeniable choice. And I kissed him back. Because maybe we weren't out of the woods yet. Maybe we had no idea what we were doing. Maybe everything was about to get a whole lot more complicated. But for now? For this moment? We had this. And that was enough.